The morning started quietly at the grand restaurant, sunlight streaming softly through the tall glass windows. The smell of fresh bread and brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with a faint hint of roses from the flower arrangements on the tables. The staff moved in a steady rhythm, carefully placing plates, folding napkins, and polishing silverware. Everyone had their role, from the chefs in the back, who were busy preparing exquisite dishes, to the waiters and waitresses moving gracefully across the polished floor. Among them was a young waitress. She was quiet, reserved, and seemed almost invisible in the midst of the bustling activity. She moved with care, her hands steady, her posture straight, and her eyes focused on her work. There was a calmness about her that made her different from the others. She did not rush, did not boast, and rarely spoke more than necessary. She had worked in the restaurant for a few years, earning respect quietly through her dedication. But she remained unnoticed by many of the guests, who were often too absorbed in their own lives to pay attention. As the doors opened to welcome the first luxury guests of the day, the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to hold its breath as a small group entered. Dressed in expensive clothes, their jewelry glinting under the soft lights, they walked with confidence, talking in loud, confident voices clearly used to being noticed and catered to. Their presence brought a different energy to the restaurant, a mix of excitement and tension. The other diners, some regulars, and some casual visitors, glanced at them with curiosity or envy, while the staff adjusted themselves. Anticipating the expectations that would come with such wealthy and prominent guests, the young waitress moved toward the entrance to greet the new guests. She offered her usual polite smile and a soft greeting. The guests barely looked at her, their attention fixed on each other and their own sense of importance. One of them, a man with a smug smile, glanced at her and whispered something to his companion, causing both of them to chuckle quietly. Their laughter was sharp, mocking, though subtle enough that not everyone noticed. She felt the sting, though she remained composed, not responding, not showing that their words had any effect on her. She had learned over the years that reacting to people like this often gave them more satisfaction than it was worth. So she simply continued to do her job, taking their coats and leading them to their reserved table near the window, where the sunlight highlighted the sparkle of their gold and diamond accessories. The table was large, set with fine china and crystal glasses. The guests seated themselves with an air of entitlement, directing the waitress as if she were a tool rather than a human being. She took the menus, offering them politely, and watched as they examined the selections with exaggerated gestures. One woman, dressed in a silk dress, made a comment under her breath, loud enough for the waitress to hear, about how ordinary the staff looked compared to them. The young waitress kept her expression neutral, but inside, she felt the familiar mix of discomfort and determination. She had faced situations like this many times, and she knew that the way to maintain her dignity was not to argue, not to show anger, but to stay calm and do her work well, as she took their orders. The guests continued to whisper to each other, occasionally laughing at things she could not hear. Their comments were not just about her appearance, but about the way she moved, the way she spoke, and even the clothes she wore. It was as if they were placing bets on her intelligence, assuming that someone who worked in a service role could not possibly have any special talents or knowledge. She listened quietly, nodding politely, writing down their complicated and unusual requests with precision. Her hand moved quickly and accurately across the notepad, making sure she did not miss a single detail. She understood that her work mattered even if they did not realize it. Behind her, the other staff members observed the scene with mixed emotions. Some of them felt protective, wishing they could defend her from the laughter and mockery. Others were used to the presence of difficult guests and knew that the best course of action was to let her handle it, as she always did with grace. The manager, standing near the kitchen door, watched carefully, ready to step in if necessary, but also trusting in her abilities. There was a quiet respect among the staff for how she conducted herself. Though few guests ever saw it, the conversation at the table grew louder, more confident, as the guests grew more comfortable in their environment. They joked about the menu, the decor, and eventually about the staff themselves. Each comment was delivered with a sense of superiority, assuming that the world revolved around them and that anyone else was there merely to serve and amuse them. The young waitress felt the familiar pressure, the weight of being underestimated. She had learned to carry it quietly, like a secret strength that others could not see. She reminded herself of the countless times she had turned similar situations around, often in ways that surprised people completely. For now, though, she stayed calm, focused on the task at hand, and continued to serve with professionalism. As the morning moved into the afternoon, more guests arrived, but the attention remained on this particular table. The wealthy guests were in the midst of their own amusement, laughing at small things and making gestures that they believed highlighted their superiority. They did not realize that every action they took was being observed, not just by the staff, but by each other, and that subtle consequences could arise from underestimating someone. The young waitress continued to approach their table, carrying drinks and dishes, answering questions, and accommodating requests with skill and grace. She moved silently yet confidently, aware of the power that came not from wealth or loud voices, but from competence, composure, and quiet intelligence. At one point, one of the guests made a particularly pointed joke, mocking her in front of the others. The laughter was sharp and meant to wound, but she did not flinch. Instead, she paused, made eye contact for just a moment, and smiled politely before continuing her work. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried a sense of unspoken strength. The other guests seemed momentarily taken aback by her calmness, though they quickly recovered, assuming they still held the upper hand. Yet, for those watching the other staff, some of the diners nearby the moment, was a quiet revelation of character. Here was someone who could be underestimated, mocked, and laughed at, yet still maintained dignity and grace without saying a word. The young waitress had a story that none of them could see. She had worked hard to get where she was, learning not only how to serve, but how to read people, how to stay calm under pressure, how to handle moments of ridicule with quiet strength. She had studied music and art in her free time, had traveled to small towns and big cities alike, and had a depth of knowledge that few could guess from her simple appearance. She knew that the moment would come when her talents would speak louder than any words. But for now, she stayed in the role assigned to her, blending into the rhythm of the restaurant, unnoticed by those who believed appearances were everything as the lunch service continued. The contrast between the young waitress and the luxury guests became even more evident. They were loud, extravagant, and unconcerned with subtlety, while she was calm, precise, and observant. Every movement she made was intentional, every gesture careful, and yet it seemed effortless. She took note of their preferences, their habits, the way they spoke, and the way they expected the world to bend to their will. These observations would serve her later. When the time came for her abilities to shine in a way no one could ignore, throughout the day, atmosphere in the restaurant shifted slightly. The other guests watched the interactions with interest, some enjoying the performance of the wealthy group, others quietly admiring the composure of the waitress. There was an unspoken tension, a feeling that something was about to change, though no one could predict what it would be. The young waitress moved from table to table, from task to task, seamlessly integrating herself into the flow of the restaurant while keeping an eye on the luxury guests, ready for the moment when her quiet strength would be revealed. As the afternoon approached, the sunlight softened, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The restaurant was full, and the luxury guests continued to laugh and joke, confident in their own importance. Yet within the calm movements of the young waitress there was a hidden energy, a sense of potential waiting to unfold. She had learned that the world often judged by appearance and status, but she also knew that true talent, intelligence, and grace could not be hidden for long. The moment when she would surprise them, when the laughter would stop and the shock would set in, was drawing closer, though no one yet realized it. For now, she remained quiet, patient, and focused, serving with skill, kindness, and an inner strength that could not be measured by wealth or mockery. She was ready, even if they did not yet know it. The afternoon moved forward with a rhythm that was both familiar and tense. The young waitress continued to serve the luxury guests, moving around the table with trays in her hands, carefully balancing dishes, glasses, and silverware. Every movement was precise, almost graceful, as if she were performing a quiet dance that only she understood. She had learned over time how to read the room, to sense moods and shifts in energy, and to anticipate what the guests wanted even before they asked. It was a skill she had developed not only from experience but from paying attention, observing, and understanding people. The luxury guests, on the other hand, had become more relaxed, more confident in their own sense of superiority. Their laughter grew louder, their gestures more exaggerated. One man leaned back in his chair, smirking, and made a comment about the simplicity of the staff uniforms, comparing them to the opulence of their own clothes. Another woman laughed and added her own remark, pointing subtly to the young waitress as if to confirm the joke. The young waitress heard every word, every chuckle, yet she did not react. She had learned that responding to such mockery often gave it more power than it deserved. Instead, she focused on her work, her expression calm, her movements deliberate. She placed plates in front of each guest, carefully arranging the food exactly as they had requested. One guest asked for a specific side dish. Another requested a drink chilled to a precise temperature. The waitress handled every request with professionalism, her hands steady and sure. As she set the glasses down, she noticed the subtle ways in which the guests tried to assert dominance, not just through words, but through gestures. Through the way they waved her over, through the sharpness of their eyes. She understood it all, and she understood that the moment they believed they could control her, they had underestimated her entirely. The guests continued their conversation. Oblivious to the quiet strength of the young waitress, they spoke loudly. Confident that no one could challenge them, that the world belonged to those who displayed wealth and status openly. Their laughter echoed through the restaurant, drawing curious glances from other diners. Some watched with amusement, some with sympathy for the waitress, but most simply turned their attention back to their own meals. The young waitress moved among them with calm efficiency, noting the small details that no one else noticed. The way one guest frowned when the wine was poured too slowly, the way another tapped her fingers impatiently on the table. These details were not lost on her. She stored them in her mind, knowing that every small observation would play a role in what was to come. At one point, one of the guests leaned forward, pretending to compliment her, while subtly mocking her at the same time. He asked if she had any special skills or talents beyond serving. And when she replied politely that she enjoyed music and had studied piano for many years, the table erupted into laughter. The group chuckled at the idea that someone who appeared so ordinary could have any remarkable skill. The young waitress felt a pang of discomfort, but she did not let it show. She simply nodded, acknowledging their laughter with a polite smile. She had learned long ago that such moments were tests, and the way she handled them would reveal her character far more than any words could. The staff around her watched the scene with quiet interest. They had all seen how she handled difficult guests before, and they admired her patience and composure. The manager, who had been observing from a distance, recognized the potential for a significant turning point. He knew the young waitress had abilities that could surprise even the most arrogant of guests, but he also knew the timing had to be right. For now, he let the situation unfold, trusting her judgment and her natural sense of timing as the meal continued. The young waitress moved back and forth, taking care of other tables while keeping an eye on the luxury guests. She noticed that their laughter had grown louder, their comments more pointed. They were enjoying their own sense of superiority, completely unaware that the moment they believed they held power was temporary. She reminded herself to stay focused, to maintain her calm demeanor, and to be ready for the moment when their assumptions would be challenged. She knew that true confidence came not from wealth or status, but from preparation, skill, and inner strength. At one point, a minor mishap occurred at the table. A guest accidentally knocked over a glass, spilling water across the pristine tablecloth. The young waitress moved immediately, offering a clean cloth and attending to the spill without a hint of panic. She handled the situation with precision, ensuring that the guests were not inconvenienced. While they continued to make jokes about her appearance, she quietly demonstrated her competence and reliability. It was a subtle form of resistance, one that went unnoticed by the guests, but observed by those who truly understood her abilities. The guests continued to test her, asking increasingly complicated questions about the menu, about the ingredients, and even about wine pairings. Each question was posed with an assumption that she would not know the answer or would have to consult someone else. Yet she responded confidently and accurately, providing details about the dishes, the origin of the ingredients, and the nuances of the flavors. The guests were momentarily surprised, their laughter faltering as they realized that their assumptions were being challenged quietly but effectively. Despite this, they continued to maintain an air of superiority, laughing at small things and making gestures that they believed emphasized their status. They did not yet understand that true respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned and recognized. The young waitress had learned this lesson long ago. She moved among the guests with a quiet grace, never raising her voice, never showing irritation. Her calmness was a stark contrast to their loud confidence, and it was this contrast that would eventually create the most impact. As the afternoon wore on, other diners began to notice the subtle tension between the young waitress and the luxury guests. Some admired her patience and professionalism, while others watched with curiosity, sensing that something unexpected might happen. The staff continued their work around the restaurant, but there was a shared understanding that the young waitress was handling a particularly challenging situation with skill. Her movements were deliberate, her gestures thoughtful, and her attention to detail unwavering. Throughout the meal, the young waitress maintained a careful balance. She listened, observed, and responded with precision. She never let the mockery reach her mind, never allowed it to cloud her judgment. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, knowing that her actions spoke louder than words. She had learned that humility, combined with skill, could create a more powerful impression than arrogance combined with wealth. Every step she took, every tray she carried, every question she answered contributed to a growing sense of respect, even if the guests themselves did not yet recognize it. At one point, a guest attempted to provoke a reaction by commenting on her appearance once more, expecting a defensive response. The young waitress simply smiled politely, nodded, and continued with her work.
Ow!
Her calm demeanor was striking, and even the most arrogant of guests began to feel a subtle shift in the energy at the table. They were used to commanding attention and receiving immediate reactions. But here was someone who maintained her composure, who responded with competence and grace rather than defensiveness. It was a quiet power, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. The lunch service continued, the luxury guests growing more comfortable, yet more unaware of the strength they were facing. They laughed and joked among themselves, oblivious to the careful observations the young waitress had made. She had noted every preference, every habit, every subtle gesture, storing them in her mind. These observations were part of a larger understanding she had developed over years of experience, a sense of timing and strategy that would eventually reveal her full abilities. By the time the meal was approaching its conclusion, had not only served with skill, but it also demonstrated quiet resilience. She had maintained her dignity, handled mockery with grace, and responded to challenges with knowledge and poise. The luxury guests had laughed, assumed superiority, and underestimated her at every turn. Yet, beneath the calm surface, a potential for surprise was building, one that would soon leave them speechless and regretful for their arrogance. As she cleared the last few plates and attended 2 final requests, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The young waitress moved with quiet confidence, knowing that the moments of mockery were temporary and that the time for revelation was approaching. The staff watched with admiration, diners watched with curiosity, and the luxury guests remained unaware of the storm of skill and talent they had dismissed so easily. She had turned every challenge into an opportunity, every insult into a display of composure, and every expectation of failure into a demonstration of quiet strength. The young waitress paused briefly, taking a deep breath as she prepared for the next interaction, the one that would change the energy in the room completely. She knew that patience, observation, and readiness were her allies, and she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had maintained control without confrontation. The luxury guests continued to laugh, unaware that their assumptions were about to be shattered, that their superiority would soon be humbled by someone they had laughed at and dismissed. For now, she continued to serve, to move through the restaurant with grace, and to prepare silently for the moment. When her true abilities would leave everyone in shock, the restaurant had grown quieter now, the lunch rush giving way to a slower afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting soft patterns on the polished floors and highlighting the gleam of crystal glasses on the tables. The young waitress moved among the tables, clearing dishes, arranging silverware, and checking on each guest with a careful and attentive eye. Even as she performed these tasks, her mind was alert, watching the luxury guests who had spent the last hours laughing at her and making subtle jokes at her expense. She knew that the moment she had been preparing for was coming closer. It began as a small incident, almost accidental. One of the guests dropped a napkin near the edge of the table and, in a playful gesture, tossed it slightly toward her. She caught it effortlessly, smiling politely, and placed it neatly on the table. The guests laughed again, thinking it was part of their game, unaware that every action, every movement she made, was being observed with a quiet precision. She had learned long ago that those who underestimated others often revealed more about themselves than about the person they mocked. The manager, who had been standing near the kitchen, observed her with a mix of pride and anticipation. He knew the young waitress had a hidden talent that had never been displayed publicly in this environment. The guest's arrogance and assumption that she was nothing more than a simple server had created the perfect stage for a dramatic revelation. Yet timing was everything. The waitress continued her work, serving other tables, responding to questions with calm authority, and silently preparing for the turning point that would change everything. The moment came unexpectedly. One of the luxury guests, leaning back in his chair, knocked over his glass of water, spilling it across the table. The group erupted into laughter, pointing at the mishap as if it were evidence of someone else's incompetence. The young waitress moved forward immediately, ready to manage the situation. But as she reached the table, she noticed something else. There was a piano in the corner of the restaurant, a beautiful, polished instrument that had been untouched for months. The manager, seeing the potential, gestured subtly toward it, understanding that this was the moment to let her talent shine. The young waitress paused, a gentle determination in her eyes. She walked to the piano, her movements calm and deliberate, ignoring the laughter and whispers of the guests. The group watched in disbelief, not understanding what was about to happen. They had assumed she was ordinary, that her life and skills were limited to serving and cleaning tables. Yet here she was, approaching the piano with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. As she seated herself at the piano, the room fell silent. Even the clinking of cutlery seemed to pause, as if the restaurant itself had taken a deep breath. She began to play, her fingers moving across the keys with precision and grace. The music flowed effortlessly, filling the room with a melody that was both powerful and delicate. Each note was perfectly placed, each chord resonating with emotion and skill. The guests, who had been laughing moments ago, were now frozen in shock, their mouths slightly open as they struggled to process what they were seeing, hearing. The music told a story that no words could convey. It was a story of patience, of quiet strength, of talent that had been nurtured and developed away from the spotlight. The young waitress played with passion, her eyes closed for brief moments, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The guests' laughter had disappeared, replaced by awe and disbelief. Some of them glanced at each other, realizing that their assumptions had been entirely wrong. They had underestimated her, dismissed her abilities, and treated her with arrogance. Now they were confronted with a reality that left them humbled. Other diners in the restaurant turned to watch. Drawn by the unexpected performance, whispers of admiration spread through the room as people recognized the extraordinary skill on display. The staff, who had known of her talent for years, exchanged looks of pride and amazement. The manager, standing nearby, allowed himself a small smile. Knowing that the young waitress was transforming the energy of the restaurant, with every note she played, the luxury guests shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of the depth and breadth of the young waitress's abilities. Their laughter, their jokes, their sense of superiority, all of it seemed shallow in comparison to the talent unfolding before them. One guest, who had been the loudest in mocking her, leaned forward, his eyes wide, unable to tear them away from the piano. Another covered his mouth, a mixture of shock and embarrassment washing over him. They had expected a performance, if any, that matched their assumptions. Simple, ordinary, forgettable. Instead, they were confronted with brilliance, skill, emotion that left them speechless. The music continued, growing in complexity and beauty. The young waitress's fingers danced across the keys, moving with a confidence and understanding that spoke of years of practice and dedication. She had taken something personal, the laughter, the mockery, the assumptions, and transformed it into an opportunity to reveal her true self. The luxury guests, who had thought they held the upper hand, were now completely humbled. Their faces showed a range of emotions: shock, regret, admiration, and even a touch of guilt for having underestimated her so thoroughly. Which had been filled with chatter and the sounds of service just moments before was now consumed by the piano's music. Even the air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her performance. Each note was a testament to her dedication. Each chord a reminder that talent could not be measured by appearances or social status. She played with a blend of technical skill and emotional depth, capturing the attention of everyone present, from the wealthy guests to the casual diners to her fellow staff members. As the final notes lingered in the air, a profound silence settled over the restaurant. The luxury guests, who had laughed and mocked her just moments ago, remained frozen in their seats. They stared at her with wide eyes, the realization of their misjudgment settling heavily on their shoulders. The young waitress, still seated at the piano, allowed herself a small, calm smile. She had not played to prove them wrong in anger or to seek revenge. She had played to express herself, to show the depth of her abilities, and to remind everyone present that appearances were not the measure of talent or character. The silence was broken by a single clap, gentle but firm, coming from a nearby diner. Soon, others joined, their applause growing louder, filling the room with admiration and respect. The luxury guests, still in shock, found themselves clapping hesitantly, their earlier arrogance replaced by a humbling acknowledgement of her talent. The young waitress rose from the piano gracefully, her movements calm, her composure intact. She had turned a moment of mockery into a moment of recognition, showing that true skill and inner strength cannot be hidden for long. The manager approached, offering a nod of approval and a quiet word of praise. The staff looked on, their eyes filled with pride and admiration. The luxury guests remained seated, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, their expressions a mix of disbelief and newfound respect. They had been challenged in the most unexpected way, confronted with a reality that their assumptions could not explain. The young waitress had taken control of the situation without confrontation, without anger, simply through her talent and poise. For the other diners, the moment became a story in itself, a tale of humility, talent, and the power of quiet confidence. Conversations resumed, but the energy of the room had shifted. There was a collective recognition that the young waitress had transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, that she had shown a level of skill and grace that transcended her role as a server. The luxury guests, who had believed themselves untouchable in their position of wealth, now had a lesson they would not forget. Never underestimate someone based on appearance or status. As the young waitress returned to her duties, she carried with her the calm satisfaction of someone who had faced mockery and emerged not only unscathed but elevated. She moved among the tables with ease, her presence now commanding quiet respect rather than laughter. The luxury guests continued to watch her, still absorbing the reality of what had just occurred. Their previous assumptions had been shattered, and they were left to reconcile the gap between what they had believed and what they had witnessed. The afternoon wore on, the restaurant filled with a sense of admiration and quiet awe. The young waitress continued her work, attentive to every detail, polite and composed. Yet the energy surrounding her had shifted dramatically. No longer underestimated, she moved with a confidence that radiated from her very presence. The guests who had laughed at her now understood the lesson she had demonstrated so clearly. Talent, skill, and strength are not always visible at first glance. They are discovered through observation, patience, and recognition of the quiet power that exists in every individual. as the final orders were cleared and the afternoon gave way to early evening. The luxury guests remained at their table, still reflecting on the performance they had witnessed. They spoke in hushed tones, acknowledging the unexpected brilliance of the young waitress. Even in their pride and wealth, they could not deny the truth. They had been humbled, taught a lesson in humility and respect, and reminded that appearances can be deceiving. The young waitress, now returning to the rhythm of the restaurant's evening service, moved with grace and calm, carrying the quiet power of her talent with her. She had transformed a moment of mockery into a revelation, a lesson, and a demonstration of strength that no one could ignore. The luxury guests had laughed at her seconds ago, but now, in a room full of admiration, they were left in awe, forever changed by the skill, composure, and quiet brilliance of a young waitress who had turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. The restaurant had settled into a rare quiet after the young waitress's unexpected piano performance. The luxury guests who had been so loud and self-assured minutes before now sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and awe. The other diners looked on with admiration, their conversations hushed, almost reverent, as they realized what had just happened. The young waitress had turned an ordinary afternoon into an extraordinary event, and her grace and skill left a lasting impression on everyone present. She rose from the piano with calm confidence. Smoothing her uniform and returning to her role as a server, she moved among the tables with the same attentiveness as before, yet the atmosphere around her had changed. There was a new energy in the room, one that recognized her as more than just a waitress. Her every step was now watched with respect, her quiet strength acknowledged even by those who had laughed at her earlier. The luxury guests, humbled by the display of talent, could not avoid the weight of their earlier arrogance. They had assumed they were superior, but the music had stripped away their sense of entitlement and replaced it with admiration and introspection. As she attended to the tables, she noticed subtle changes in the guests' behavior. The man who had been the loudest in mocking her now looked at her with a new kind of curiosity, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He asked questions, not in a tone of superiority, but of genuine interest, seeking to understand the depth of her skill. The others followed suit, their gestures and words now tempered with respect. The young waitress responded with her usual politeness and calm demeanor, never gloating, never displaying superiority. She understood that the moment of revelation was hers to carry gracefully, not to exploit. The staff behind the scenes exchanged looks of pride and relief. They had always known of her abilities, but watching her demonstrate them so effortlessly in front of guests who had mocked her was a powerful experience. The manager stepped forward, offering a quiet nod of approval. He had trusted her instincts and her preparation, and now, seeing the result, he felt a sense of satisfaction and pride. The young waitress had not only handled the situation, but had turned it into a defining moment for herself and the restaurant. The luxury guests began to speak softly among themselves. Reflecting on their behavior, their arrogance had been laid bare. They were forced to confront the fact that they had judged someone unfairly based on appearance and role. There was a subtle tension as they processed the reality of the situation. They realized that true talent and strength often come from unexpected places, and that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Their laughter, which had once been sharp and mocking, had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative silence. The young waitress moved with precision and care, attending to orders, clearing plates, and checking on each table. Her demeanor remained calm and composed, unaffected by the previous mockery or the astonishment of the guests. She had learned long ago that grace, under pressure, and quiet confidence could have a far greater impact than anger or retaliation. Each gesture she made now carried a sense of quiet authority, testament to her skills, her patience, and her understanding of human nature. The atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift further. Diners who had been casual observers were now engaged, watching the young waitress with interest and admiration. Conversations had resumed, but the energy was different, filled with recognition of the talent and composure she had displayed. The luxury guests, still absorbing the reality of their misjudgment, began to ask her questions about her musical background and training. For the first time, they approached her not as someone to mock, but as someone worthy of attention and respect. She responded modestly, sharing her experiences and the years she had spent learning and practicing music. Her voice was calm, her words simple, but they carried the weight of genuine skill and dedication. The guests listened intently, their expressions softening as they realized that their assumptions had been shallow and superficial. They began to appreciate the effort, discipline, and talent that had remained hidden beneath the surface. The young waitress did not boast or seek validation. She simply shared her story with honesty and humility. As the afternoon turned into evening, the restaurant filled with a sense of warmth and admiration. The staff moved with renewed energy, inspired by the young waitress's performance and the way she had handled the situation. The manager offered quiet guidance, ensuring that the evening service continued smoothly. But the energy in the room was now undeniably changed. Patrons spoke in low tones, acknowledging the remarkable event they had witnessed. Even the luxury guests, who had arrived with loud confidence, now moved with a more respectful and humble air. The young waitress continued to serve, her movements deliberate and calm. She took note of small details, the way guests responded to service, subtleties in their behavior, and the way they now interacted with her. She had turned a moment of mockery into an opportunity for transformation, not only for herself, but for those around her. Every interaction now carried a sense of significance, a reminder that respect and recognition are earned through skill, composure, and authenticity. At one table, a family of diners watched with fascination. They whispered among themselves, commenting on the young waitress's talent and the humility she displayed. They admired her ability to remain calm in the face of mockery and to use her skills to create a moment of profound impact. The luxury guests, noticing their reactions, began to understand that their previous behavior had been inappropriate and that their arrogance had been misplaced. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, had created a moment that would forever change their perception. The young waitress moved between tables with a quiet confidence, handling requests with skill and attentiveness. She managed a particularly challenging table with ease, anticipating needs before they were voiced and responding to unexpected situations with calm precision. One guest accidentally knocked over a utensil. She moved immediately to correct the situation, her movements fluid and confident. She handled every task with the same grace that had captivated the room during her piano performance, demonstrating that her talents extended beyond music to every aspect of her work. The luxury guests watched in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by a sense of humility. They began to speak softly among themselves, acknowledging the depth of her abilities and the dignity with which she had conducted herself. They had been confronted with a reality that challenged their assumptions, and they were forced to reconcile their previous behavior with the impressive display of skill and composure before them. The young waitress had turned a moment of mockery into a lesson in respect, demonstrating that true strength lies in patience, preparation, and quiet confidence. As the evening progressed, the restaurant's atmosphere continued to evolve. The energy was no longer dominated by the loud confidence of the wealthy guests, but by a sense of admiration, respect, and recognition for the young waitress's abilities. The staff worked seamlessly, inspired by her example and motivated to uphold the high standards she had demonstrated. The manager observed with satisfaction, knowing that the young waitress had not only handled a difficult situation, but had also elevated the entire restaurant experience. The luxury guests, still processing the events, began to ask questions about the young waitress's background, her training, and her experiences. They listened with genuine interest, their previous arrogance replaced by curiosity and respect. They began to understand that their assumptions had been shallow, and that true talent often exists in unexpected places. The young waitress responded with humility, sharing her experiences without seeking praise, demonstrating that confidence and skill do not require validation from others. Other diners in the restaurant observed the interactions. Inspired by the young waitress's composure and talent, conversations shifted from casual commentary to discussions about resilience, humility, and the power of quiet strength. The luxury guests, now fully aware of the impact of their previous behavior, moved with a newfound respect and understanding. They had been humbled by a display of talent that transcended their expectations, and they carried with them a lesson in humility and recognition. The young waitress continued to serve with grace, her attention to detail and her calm demeanor creating a sense of stability and reassurance in the restaurant. Every interaction reinforced her quiet authority and skill, reminding guests and staff alike that true strength is often found in patience, preparation, and composure. The luxury guests, still reflecting on their misjudgment, observed her closely, recognizing the depth of her abilities and the dignity with which she carried herself.